In this Shadow of the Erdtree video, I'm going to be showing you my Double Dragon build. This is a Poison build and Scarlet Rot build that focuses on using Dane's Footwork, which is another hand-to-hand weapon, one we haven't showcased before, and the Ash of War, the Poison Flower, blooms twice. People have been asking me to make a build showcasing this Ash of War, so let's get into how this works. So let's talk about the Ash of War first, and then we'll get into the weapon, because the Ash of War is really where this build begins. And what the Poison Flower blooms twice does is it effectively does damage with the kick itself. When you teleport dive into an enemy, if you make direct contact with the kick, you're going to deal damage. There's a little bit of an AoE that deals damage. And if the target that you connect with has Poison or Scarlet Rot on them, it's going to deal 5% of their max health, plus 250 damage. And obviously that's on top of the mini little AoE that does for a little bit of damage and the direct kick itself. So you can get very, very high damage when you land this on a target that has one of these status effects already on them. Additionally, this skill does some stance damage, but it does quite a bit of Scarlet Rot buildup. I don't know exactly how much it does, but it's like in the 150 to 200 range of Scarlet Rot buildup. So that means if you have like Scarlet Rot on your target, or you have Poison on your target, and then you hit them with this, you're going to be building up Scarlet Rot once again, even if you rip Scarlet Rot off of them, or Poison off of them. So it gets really tricky to use this, because remember that enemies or bosses become more and more resistant to status effects as you use them on them. So if you trigger Scarlet Rot and then you rip it off the boss, and then you try and trigger Scarlet Rot again using this skill and then rip it off the boss, etc., it's going to get harder and harder to do. And something else worth noting is that if the target that you hit with the Poison Flower blooms twice has both Poison and Scarlet Rot on it, it doesn't seem to do that much extra damage, in my opinion. I don't actually think it does any extra damage, but it was really hard to tell in my testing, because you have the health of the boss ticking down from both status effects. You have the actual hit of the kick itself and the small AoE that does a little bit of damage as well. So it's hard factoring all those things in to tell exactly if it does slightly more damage or not. But I can tell you for a fact, it does not do 10% max health plus 500 damage, which would be double what it should be. So you're not getting those damage numbers from that, which means that you'd be better off alternating stacking these status effects rather than stacking them both at the same time. Otherwise, you're not going to get that extra damage from ripping them off. Because remember, each time you apply a status effect, it gets harder to do. So if you stack both status effects and then rip them off, and then stack both and then rip them off, you're not getting as much damage as if you stack one, rip it off, stack another, rip it off, stack another, rip it off, stack another, rip it off, and alternate. But there are exceptions to this, of course. For instance, you might not want to rip these off, right? Ripping these off immediately means you're not getting damage over time. So there might be instances where you might not want to do this. I will say that the vast majority of bosses that I fought, alternating seems to be the best way, but there are some boss fights and some phases in boss fights that just work better when you leave the status effects on. For instance, if you're fighting the Divine Lion fight and you have Poison or Scarlet Rot on him when he goes into his lightning phase, leave it on him. Back away, dodge, let the health tick away. You have 90 seconds of either one of these status effects from the time you apply it before it disappears. And remember, if you use this weapon skill, it's going to do the same damage if you wait till 89 seconds as if you do it in 1 damage when you connect with the weapon skill. So you might as well let some time go by. There's no real rush for you to do it right away. You can wait for the opportune moment to do this. And there are just phases of boss fights where it's really hard to hit them. And you might as well just let the damage tick away on them while you're like waiting for your opportunity to use this weapon skill. And that being said, some of the more difficult boss fights in the game, you might want to double stack both of these and then not remove them and just kind of fight with your regular attacks and let the damage over time tick away on them while you're fighting. You can absolutely do that. And one of the things I really love about the way we're set up for this is that you can do any of these things. You can alternate, you can double stack, you can wait for the opportune moment to attack and rip off health. All these things are great in this build, so you have flexibility in how you handle it. So I'm using Dane's Footwork for my weapon here, and there are a couple reasons for this. First of all, the weapon skill that we're using, the Poison Flower blooms twice, is actually a kick. With the kick animation, this means that the Shattered Stone Talisman will boost the damage of it if you have it equipped, which we do. Dane's Footwork features a lot of kicks in its attacks, whether it's regular attacks, jump attacks, running attacks, etc. And these are all boosted by the Shattered Stone Talisman as well. So kind of the general strategy is you go into a fight and you start kicking the foe, right? You start fighting them, kicking them, and once you trigger Poison, then you're going to use the Poison Flower blooms twice to rip off a huge chunk of health and start building up Scarlet Rot. And then you're going to use the Poison Flower blooms twice until you triggered Scarlet Rot on the target, and then you can either do two things. You can either use it again to rip it off and then repeat this process with kicks building up poison, Or you can leave the Scarlet Rot on and then just start kicking it and put poison on it as well and double stack damage over time and just fight regularly while the poison and Scarlet Rot tick away on the target. Either of these is up to you depending on the boss fight that you're in and how that's going. So then I have Poisoned Hand in my offhand. What this is going to do is give us 7.5% more attack power when we trigger Poison or Scarlet Rot. So this works kind of like Kindred of Rot's Exaltation, but for less damage. So we just keep it in our offhand for that passive buff. Then I have no armor equipped here, and I'm using the Rock Heart, which transforms you into a dragon. And this gives you protection, some protection, 10% damage negation for 0 weight. And why that's important for this build is we have a light setup. We're using the Blue Dancer Charm to further boost our physical damage, since all the damage we're dealing is physical, except for the poison ripoffs that come off the boss's health, which are just based off their health and don't change. So by keeping our equip load really, really light, we're like at 6 with this build, we're going to have very increased damage from that talisman. Then, as I mentioned, we have the Shattered Stone Talisman as well. This increases all the kicks we do. It increases our weapon skill damage. So this is really good for this build because it basically affects almost every attack we do. Then we have Shard of Alexander to further boost the Poison Flower Bloom's twice damage when you hit with a kick. It's not going to improve the damage that you rip off a boss when you remove a status effect, but it is going to improve the damage of the kick, and we do hit with that kick a lot. We use it quite a bit, which is why I have it here. And then lastly, we have Kindred of Rot's Exaltation. This increases your attack power when you set Poison or Scarlet Rot, just like the Poison Hand does. So this is really good when you trigger this. This is constantly in a boss fight, especially when you're alternating between Poison and Scarlet Rot. So this should be almost 100% uptime in most boss fights. And you will trigger it out on the landscape from killing one enemy to another, because you usually set Poison on an enemy before they die. But if you are having trouble with this one, like you're not triggering it all that often or as much as you want, you can always replace this with Crusade Insignia out on the landscape. And one thing I want to mention is that Rotten Wing Sword Insignia does have a place in this build. However, we are not playing hyper aggressively in this build. We are trying to trigger status effects and then let those status effects do the work for us before using our weapon skill to get big burst damage. We're not trying to hit repeatedly over and over and over every second of the fight, trying to stack up damaging buffs with how quick this moveset is, even though you could play that way. So Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, I find, is a good alternative when you're fighting like poison immune enemies or bosses, for instance, where Kindred of Rot's Exaltation isn't going to trigger. Rotten Wing Sword Insignia is not a bad substitute there, particularly in boss fights where Crusade Insignia isn't going to play much of a role. And I will say something else that you can do if you are fighting an enemy that is poison immune but not bleed immune is you could change the infusion of this to bleed or blood in order to proc blood and use the Lord of Blood's Exaltation in its place. This would allow you to trigger bleeding a lot during your boss fight and get a lot of damage from that. So attribute-wise for this build, at 164, I have 60 Vigor, 27 Mind, 28 Endurance, 30 Strength, 30 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, 7 Faith, and 45 Arcane. You don't need any Intelligence or Faith for this build. 60 Vigor is there because we're wearing basically paper-thin armor. You are going to get hit sometimes, and you don't want to die. You won't need to go higher than this. Vigor drops off significantly from this point, so don't go higher in Vigor. Mind is at 27 in order to allow us to use the Poison Flower Blooms twice liberally. It is not a super expensive Ashen War at 14, but it's not dirt cheap either, so you will need some Mind in order to be able to use this a lot during boss fights and out on the landscape. Keep in mind, too, that if you have lower Mind value and you want to dump points elsewhere, you could use something like the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman to replenish FP either in boss fights or out on the landscape. Endurance is at 28 because we need stamina for this build. It's a very stamina-hungry build between using the weapon skill, attacking regularly, and dodging. So you want a decent amount of endurance in order to get some stamina. Strength and Dexterity are at 30 here each because the weapon, even though you were at the Poison or Blood Infusion if you're fighting poison-immune enemies, still scales better with Strength and Dexterity than Arcane. We need some Arcane up to about 45-ish in that range in order to not only increase our damage, but also our poison buildup, so we're getting as much as we can per hit. It starts to really drop off from that point in Arcane, so you really don't want to go too much higher there. You can, if you go to New Game Plus or Plus Plus. But moving forward to get more damage, you're going to increase Strength and Dexterity almost simultaneously. They seem to have almost exactly the same scaling, so you want to bring those up together to get more damage. So for Flask of Wonders Physique here, I have the Green Burst Crystal tier for stamina recovery. You can never really have too much stamina recovery. You could also use the Thorny Crack tier in order to increase your damage with successive hits, but again, we don't focus too much on that in this build unless you're playing super aggressively. So if you find yourself playing aggressively, you might swap that in. And I also like the Opaline hard tier here to give us more protection because we simply aren't wearing, again, hardly any armor at all. So getting extra protection is good. And then for Great Runes, where Dodds is good, getting FP, HP, and Stamina are all good for this build. Godric's is also not a terrible choice. You are using 6 of the 8 stats, so you could get good value out of Godric's as well. So that wraps up my Double Dragon build. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. This is a ton of fun to play. Arguably one of my favorite builds I've played so far. There's just so much versatility to it. It does tons of damage. It's really good whether you want to play offensively or defensively. You can play both ways, and I would urge you to check it out. As always, if you have comments or tips about this build, please leave them in the comments, and I will try and get back to them as soon as I can.